Hey folks, Zach Osterman here. I'm Insider Indianapolis Star with your Friday rundown for September 12th, 2025. Going to do things a little bit differently today, but just to lead off with a couple of housekeeping notes first, please, as always, remember to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We've expanded our viewership a ton here in the last month or two, and that's allowed us to expand our reach a lot and expand our content. We're going to keep expanding with things like this, with the podcast, with the postgame show, all those different kinds of things. So tell your friends, tell your family. Please like and subscribe and keep coming back. Again, going to do something a little bit bigger. I got my agenda right over here. A few housekeeping notes. First of all, IndyStar.com check the YouTube Shorts page for three things I'll be, maybe less so keys and more three things I'll be looking at in tonight's Indiana State game. Some players, some areas of the field, some areas of the roster. So that's over in the shorts page in the channel. Go check that out. A few notes from around IU sports in general. You probably saw this, Hoosier hysteria, or what is probably going to be Hoosier hysteria adjacent this season, is going to be held down on Kirkwood in early October. That's going to be fascinating. Obviously, everyone's going to be hoping for good weather, but I think it's a clear desire to sort of bring the basketball team to the students, because it's fair to say the student section has kind of disconnected from the program, I think, in some meaningful ways in the last few years. And Indiana is always going to want to weaponize its student section. And I think this is a way to try and get to that student population in particular. Of course, there will be, other segments of the fan base present at that. But I think going down to Kirkwood, getting kind of into the downtown nightlife is really a priority for that event. And we'll have more on it as it gets closer. We will cover it, obviously. But, that's people who'd wondered where Hoosier hysteria was going. Well, it's going down to Kirkwood. Soccer's number one. We've got a story at indystar.com/sports about Holden Brown, Indiana starting goalkeeper, Virginia transfer, overcame 2 torn ACLs, one in each knee, to get back on the field for Indiana this year. He's a Zionsville native. He actually grew up friends with one of Todd Yeagley's sons, Grant. So he knows IU soccer well. He transferred in last year, but he had the second ACL tear kind of unexpectedly. He suffered it and didn't realize it, so he had to sit out last season. But he won the goalkeeping competition this year, and he's kept 3 straight clean sheets. Indiana's, I don't know if I have the number right off the top of my head. I think it's 358 minutes Indiana's gone without conceding a goal since the second minute against Green Bay 4 games ago, and Holden Brown's obviously been a big piece of that. So when the Hoosiers open Big Ten play at 8 p.m. Saturday at home against Michigan, you'll see number 99 between the sticks for Indiana, and you can read about his journey at indystar.com/sports. A really good note to kind of round up here from my editor, Aaron Ferguson. Steve Aird with a win, I believe it was over Bowling Green yesterday. Volleyball is up at an invitational in Chicago. Steve Aird became the 4th coach in IU history to win 100 matches as IU volleyball coach, and this is Indiana's first 5-0 start of his tenure. The Miami game remains kind of the Miami match remains kind of the signature win so far. But I think it's fair to say there's some real momentum behind IU volleyball. We've been talking about them for the last 2 or 3 weeks in these Friday rundowns, and I think we're going to have reason to keep talking about them at least for a while, if not for the whole season. So I wanted to zoom out for the sort of main topic today, because this made a lot of news, and without being flippant, obviously IU Indiana State is a bit of is kind of a game that everyone is just sort of ready to get over with and get on to Illinois. And of course, we will have tons of coverage of IU Illinois next week, probably starting, let's be honest, tonight. Again, we're talking Friday morning. We'll probably have, coverage beginning Friday night of IU Illinois. It's this discussion that popped up out of Ohio State this week, where Ted Carter, who is Ohio State's president, did an interview with my colleague Steve Berkowitz at USA Today, and Carter essentially acknowledged, and I'm scrolling looking for the exact quote, Carter essentially acknowledged that there might be a conversation about unequal revenue sharing going into the next Big Ten television deal, which will be renegotiated. The current one ends in 2030, so they'll start renegotiating that deal relatively soon, within the next probably 2 or 3 years. And Carter, I would present his comments as probably somewhat reluctant if you read them sort of in their entirety, and he did not sort of press the red button, so to speak. I mean, this was not a kind of a nuclear statement. But what I would also point out is Carter was the president at Nebraska for 4 years, and I believe he just started as president at Ohio State in January of this year. The point is he's very familiar with the Big Ten, and he's very familiar with the financials of the Big Ten. He's also very familiar with the strength of sort of financial harmony within the Big Ten. It has always been a real strength of the conference that it has among fully fledged members. Oregon and Washington still don't get full cuts, but among fully fledged members, everyone gets the same revenue. The Big Ten takes a revenue share for itself to pay its operating expenses, and then everyone else takes what is pooled of primarily media rights money, bowl money, some other income sources as well. Those are probably the two biggest ones, especially obviously the media rights money or the TV money. The SEC and the Big Ten both split equally. And, we have seen this lever pulled in smaller conferences and of course the ACC is probably the prime example, but the Big 12 did this previously where it had an unequal revenue share. Basically, the ACC revised its revenue sharing structure to essentially incentivize teams or to pay teams that have more success on television, getting on television, drawing certain viewership numbers, etc., paying them more than the schools in the ACC that don't. So basically, if you're on TV more often, if you're drawing bigger TV audiences, you're going to get a greater share of the ACC's annual media deal, the ACC's annual sort of, whole distribution pie. That was an effort to kind of calm, in particular, Florida State and Clemson, which were actively, I think it's fair to say, exploring ways to break the ACC's grant of rights and get out of the ACC into a conference that was going to promise them more money overall. And we'll get to that in a minute, or what those numbers look like in a minute. The idea is that up until now, the conferences that did this had to, because there were such sort of dramatic concerns about losing some of the more financially lucrative and appealing brands within the conference. Again, the Big 12 in Texas, the ACC and FSU and Clemson, that they felt they needed to do this. The Big Ten has never felt that way. The SEC has never felt that way because they've always made the most money. The Big Ten, I believe last year the total per school distributed was $63.2 million. This year, in the fiscal year currently ongoing, that number is expected to be about $75 million. And I think there's been a suggestion from a couple of different Big Ten schools that they think that number could cross the 80 million threshold in the next 2 to 3 years. By comparison, and I looked at these numbers for Virginia Tech specifically, Virginia Tech reported, I believe, 28 million in media rights specific revenues. You're talking about, and I'll get to why I sort of pulled out Virginia Tech specifically in a minute, but you're talking about just a dramatic difference. We are not talking about two, we are not talking about sort of two, neighbors, one of whom drives a nicer car or has a boat in the garage. We're talking about people that we're talking about conferences whose schools are living in completely different neighborhoods. And to use Virginia Tech as the example, Whit Babcock, and some of you may have heard about this, Virginia Tech's athletics director, went in front of his board of regents or trustees, whatever Virginia Tech has. And he was essentially pitching the idea that he was going to need significant university funding over the next several years to remain financially competitive in college athletics. And in that meeting, he spelled out that Virginia Tech reported $122 million in athletics revenues overall in the fiscal year 2024, the one that ended June 30th, or presumably, I'm assuming that's around then is at least when that fiscal year probably ended for Virginia Tech. I'm looking at the numbers over here. Indiana last year, same fiscal year, reported $173.5 million in annual revenues. Now, Virginia Tech has a larger football stadium. It has, I would say, historically, maybe not recently, but historically, a much more football-driven fan base. And if you look at the numbers, and I pulled out 3 numbers out of each school's NCAA financial report: ticket sales, parking and concessions, and then licensing revenues specific to football. Virginia Tech last year reported $28.3 million in income, in revenue, in ticket sales, parking, concessions, other game day revenues, and licensing income specifically related to football. Now, these numbers can get played with a little bit. It's never a perfect comparison, but that's $28.3 million for Virginia Tech. Indiana, those same three numbers added up, reported $12.8 million. And that's obviously in what was a very successful season for IU on the football field. The old structure of determining who makes the money in college sports, which is who has the biggest football program, is very much antiquated. It is a nostalgia piece at this point. What matters is, and I think everyone knows this, but I think it's important to spell out those numbers. What matters is what conference you are in and how financially competitive that conference, your position within that conference is. And in the Big Ten right now, everyone is making the same amount of money, other than Oregon and Washington, which are being sort of ramped up the way that we did with Maryland and Rutgers and so forth. What Ted Carter did this week was, again, I think float a trial balloon for the idea that might change, that might need to change. And I think that the most important quote that he actually probably gave, Steve Berkowitz, again, my colleague at USA Today, was he said, quote, "I will say that there's only a couple of schools that really represent the biggest brands in the Big Ten, and you can see that by the TV viewership." While Carter was not just sort of planting his flag on the idea that Ohio State's going to demand this, I mean, if anything, he was kind of reluctant to say something that really nodded directly at that. Invoking TV viewership as essentially a benchmark in this kind of conversation, I think, speaks volumes unto itself, because, again, as we have discussed, that is how the ACC, to a lesser extent some G6 conferences, have had to restructure their media rights distributions to keep their more moneyed and appealing and popular members who might want to leave, to keep them happy. The timing on this is interesting, and I think it's important to know, like, why we're starting to talk about it now. The Big Ten TV deal expires in 2030. The Big 12, I'm looking at my notes again, forgive me, I don't mean to not look at the camera. The Big 12's current deal expires in 31. The NCAA tournament deal expires in 32. The SEC's current deal expires in 34, and the ACC's doesn't until 36. There is a belief, I would say it's fair to say it's pretty entrenched and widespread around college athletics, that the next big round of sort of, the next big sort of tectonic shift in college athletics, whether that is TV rights, whether that is, conferences consolidating more, whatever it is, the playoff expanding. Obviously, the playoff expansion is going to be ongoing as a discussion, but a lot of that other stuff is likely to come up again around the time that these contracts start expiring and everyone starts reaching for the money. And the reason why is because there used to be what seemed like a never-ending pot of money, a bottomless well of money. And for about 10 or 15 years, when a conference's TV deal expired, it just looked at the deal that the most recently negotiated deal, it put like an 8% sort of tax on top of that, and that was what it asked for from whatever its television partner or partners were. The money's not run out, but the money's not expanding anymore. And so what we're doing now, and this is what killed the Pac-12, as a lot of people probably know, what we're doing now is taking money from some people to give it, from some entities to give it to others. And as these deals start to expire, and in particular the bigger conferences, and maybe to some extent the NCAA tournament as well, because it's such a monolithic entity within college sports financially, are going to start asking for a bigger share of the pie. That bigger share is probably the pie's not going to get bigger. Somebody else's share is going to get smaller, if that makes sense. And who that is, we don't know. But, well, I think we can certainly hazard some guesses. But the point is, everyone is starting to position themselves for a world where sort of the financial Hunger Games of college athletics resume in earnest. I think we'll get a couple more years of, other than the playoff, everything being a little bit more calm. Of course, there's a lot going on in Congress that could affect that, and that's a kind of a sidecar discussion that's an important one, but would take up too much time today. The key with Ohio State is, in theory, if you look at the traditional structures, even like by modern standards in college athletics, Ohio State doesn't have an ace to play in this conversation. Clemson and Florida State can threaten to leave. Texas, when it was in the Big 12, could threaten to leave. Ohio State has nowhere to go. Ohio State's not going to leave the Big 10 for the SEC. And Ohio State's not going to become independent. So what is Ohio State? What is the threat that Ohio State can make to leverage this to go in the direction it wants to? It's a super league. Now, this has been an ongoing discussion for a long time in college athletics. I know smart people in TV who for years have said that is the only natural endpoint of all this, whether it's a 20-team league, 24, 32, 40, whether it's the Big Ten and the SEC and Notre Dame going off and doing their own thing, selling their rights together and letting everybody else just kind of pick the bones of what's left. We don't know. But that has been widely perceived as where this is going for a long time. I will say that some of those same people that I talk to that are much smarter than I am on the TV side have begun to backtrack somewhat on that and just say they don't know if the money is there. They don't know if the money is there to make it worth it, to make it worthwhile for everyone, because cord cutting, streaming have just eaten into too many of these revenue streams. And it just may not be practical there may not be an amount of money someone can get together that says this makes it worth it to forsake all tradition and all familiar structure in college athletics and just do something completely and utterly different that is going to completely change the product, right? Because if it's the same 30 teams playing each other all year, then you're essentially just, almost like an NFL 2, but you're trying to sell a product that whose brand strength is its regionality. The idea of, representing the Midwest or playing your in-state rival or whatever, but you're stripping it of that regionality for just, sheer brand power. It's going to feel something more like an NFL 2. And I think there are people that are beginning to wonder if the money is going to be there at the level that's necessary. And there are all kinds there's the Smash Capital people, private equity kind of wants to get involved in this. And that could obviously change the numbers, of course. Again, we could pull on a lot of threads in this, but that's kind of that's the lever that Ohio State can pull that makes this happen, is if it can get a few schools together and say, don't we really anymore have a lot more sort of familiar connection to Alabama and LSU and Georgia than we do Northwestern and Illinois and Purdue and Indiana? That's essentially kind of that's the red line. That's the one red line that Ohio State, if it wanted to push this further, has to cross. Now, this did feel like a trial balloon. It's probably, as much as anything, just sort of a bit of a shot across the bow to say, hey, we're going to expect to have some real influence over what happens next financially in the Big Ten, whether it's the media rights deal, the playoff, any other kinds of revenues the Big Ten opens up. I often, when we have this discussion, I often point people to the parallels in European football. People will know, of course, I'm a big soccer fan. We have seen structures like the Super League, the Premier League, for example, which is very much a kind of a model to follow for Greg Sankey. The Champions League, which I would argue is essentially akin to the college football playoff, something that presents the illusion of money and access to everyone in the sport, while we can all recognize in practice it is going to fill the sort of the coffers of a very small number of elite and already rich institutions. We've been threatening a Super League in European football for at least 25 years, basically since the advent of the Champions League and the Premier League in the early 90s. And it's come close a couple of times, but every time there has been pushback, and it's always felt a little bit more like a bargaining chip than it has an actual sort of intentional decision. They did try kind of on the other side of COVID to form one, and the backlash was so strong and so universal that it literally lasted like 72 hours before all the biggest clubs, other than I think Real Madrid and possibly Barcelona, pulled out. That's always going on in the background there, and I think it will always be going on in the background here. The question is, will anybody ever just pull the trigger? Will anybody pull the lever that sort of leads to collapsing a lot of these institutions? I think we're a long way from that, personally. And again, I think it is... I think this is much more about maybe floating a trial balloon and just sending a signal that says, if you're Ohio State, says to the Big Ten, don't forget about us. We are your biggest brand. We are your biggest sell. We are going to want a seat at the table when it comes to renegotiating the TV deal or talking about playoff expansion or how things are distributed, how money is distributed. That's what I think, at least for the moment, that is what I think we're talking about here. But it is meaningful that the president of Ohio State University said this on the record to USA Today. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about what does it mean? Why is it important? What could it mean going forward? And I hope that contextualized some of it for you. I know this is a slightly longer video today, but there was a lot that I wanted to get into to really explain, kind of the ins and outs of the finances of this, the politics of this. And again, we could go for another hour and still probably not cover all our bases, but we're going to call it for today. 21 minutes is probably enough. This has been the Friday Rundown for September 12th, 2025. Obviously, come back tonight for our postgame show. Mind your banners postgame from Memorial Stadium as Indiana takes on Indiana State. And please remember to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel for the Indianapolis Star. I'm Zach Osterman. We'll talk to you soon.